I had a client drop off a base that they wanted a square to round table made. Now, I had never made a square to round table. I've made plenty of square tables and plenty of round tables, but never one that goes from one to the other. We decided on making the top out of oak. So here you see I'm using the red oak and cutting these boards to length. These were originally 10-foot long boards. And seeing as the table is going to be a 60-inch circle, I'm cutting them to 65 inches to give me some wiggle room. I normally raise the blade a tooth height above, but this is my first time using this table saw, and that wasn't enough with the guard. As you can see right here, the guard was too low, so I had to raise it up a little higher to accept the rip thickness of the wood. Here I'm just ripping the boards about half before I put them over the jointer, just to get some of the cupping out of the boards. They're about 1.5 inches thick. Here you see me just running the boards over the jointer. I wanted to get one face and then one edge flat. I then ran the boards through the planer, and they ended up being a little bit over 1 inch thick. I can then make the final rip pass on the table saw, getting all the boards to be the same width. I had a couple boards that ended up being a little narrower than the other ones, and I just used those for the ends of the table, which would get cut off anyway when I made the circle. I then took all the pieces and laid them out on the table saw just so that I can decide which pieces look best next to which ones to create the tabletop. I then just took a longer stick and measured 30 inches and then just drilled a hole for the pencil, chose a center point in the table that I would literally use as my center point, and then drew the 60-inch circle. Then from that center point, I marked down 21 inches so that the table would be 42 inches square and 60 inches when round. Here I'm marking the depth of the dominoes so that when I cut out the circle or the square, no dominoes will be exposed. I wanted to make sure that all you saw was wood, no joinery. I glued the top in 3 different panels just because it was way too big to try to glue up all at once. There's no way I would be able to get it all together before the glue started to set. I did a dry run with all the dominoes first just to make sure everything would fit properly before I started to glue it all together. After taking the panel out of the clamps, I like to remove as much of the dried up glue as I can. I found myself personally that a chisel is my best friend for the job. scrapers, for me at least, always somehow leave scratches on the wood. So I found that a nice sharp chisel, you can get all the glue off really quickly without gouging the wood. Next was to glue the 3 panels together. This was not easy as this was already over 60 inches in all directions. I ended up using 3 pipe clamps with full 10-foot sections of pipes to put it together. My thought was to get the dominoes in place with glue on the 2 side panels, and then get the glue on the middle panel and use the clamps to actually push them together. And I found that that actually worked pretty well. Trying to just use the mallet on a piece of wood this big wasn't really doing much. So here you can see I actually used the mallet to just get the dominoes lined up and started in the holes. And then right here, I start actually using the clamps themselves to push the wood together. Once dry, I took the clamps off and used a jigsaw to cut outside the line of the circle I made earlier. Then I used a router with a shop-made circle cutting jig to cut out the 60-inch circle. I made sure to take multiple light passes. This way I could avoid chip out on the end grain. I got the hardware for this table from kpeterson.com. The way this kit works is like that. So you have one hinge here, one hinge here. This is kind of a little lever. See, it's angled. So it comes separate. You put it like that. You line it up with the line. And this goes where the bar ends. So the wedge pushes the bar so that way the leaf gets flat with the square. One thing I did want to make sure is that the screws wouldn't go through the top. So I have a piece of scrap from the cutoff of the circle that I'm going to just pre-drill. Screw it all the way in, and it does not go through. So I then marked out the exact placement where I would cut off the leaves for the table. Before that, it was kind of just a rough estimate, so I would know where to place the dominoes. But this was more precise. And I used a track saw to cut off the leaves. If you don't have a track saw, you could easily use a circular saw with a straight edge. Even a jigsaw with a straight edge would work. But I had a track saw, so that's what I used. And at first, I marked out which leaf went to which section of the table. But then I thought about it, and I knew I could match up the grain with the leaf. Not to mention the numbers would be sanded off once I started the sanding process. But it was really easy to just match the leaf to the side of the table that was cut off. There was enough variation in the grain. Here I am just taping up the underside of the table where there are knots or voids in the wood so that I can fill them with epoxy on the top side. I didn't want any of that leaking onto my table saw surface. And then once the epoxy dried, I get the fun of sanding. And there was lots of sanding to do. The customer requested in the middle of the table a Lazy Susan that would be flush with the surface. So here I'm gluing what would be the top for the Lazy Susan. And the Lazy Susan was going to be a 12-inch diameter circle. As you can see, I made sure to put plenty of clamps on this. After all, didn't want it to go anywhere. Once the glue was dry, all the clamps came off. I scraped off the glue, and then I ran it through the drum sander just to make sure it was nice and flat. Then it was time to route out the area where the Lazy Susan would sit. So I used the CNC to cut out this circle, and then I used the scrap piece of the circle, and I put a hole in the center of the circle, put that where the center of the table was that I used for the circle cutting jig, and then I was able to put the outside of the circle right around the circle. And then I could use that and a router bit with an edge guide to route out the outside edges of the circle, since I was going to need to route out the whole thing. It took a few passes, but I was able to get the whole border done. Then I was able to take off the template, so to speak, and I now have the area that I need to route out. I switched to a 3/4 inch bit and just started removing material. Now I would do a little bit at a time of the circle and then lower the bit and then do some more and then lower the bit again. I made sure I lowered the bit 3 times. And I made sure I went all the way down in small spaces because I wanted to make sure that the router still had decent contact area for the bottom plate. I didn't want to rock. And I tried to go as slow and steady as I could. Once it was all routed out, I made sure that the Lazy Susan base fit and that the top was flush with the table. I even made a little finger indentation to be able to pull it out. And more sanding. There was a lot of sanding. I then put on a coat of sanding sealer, which is shellac diluted 50% with denatured alcohol. And more sanding. Then I put a stain on the wood. And did the same thing for the top as well. I started with the bottom first, then flipped it over and did the top last. First a coat of sanding sealer, let it dry, sanded, and then took all the dust off, and then a coat of stain. Again, just wiping it on, letting it sit for a couple minutes, and then wiping it off, making sure not to leave any excess stain on the wood. And then came the finishing. I used a water-based polyurethane. Again, did the bottoms first. They received 3 coats, and then flipped everything over into the top. The top received 6 coats of finish. And I sanded in between each coat with 320 grit, and then 800 before the final coat. Here, I brought the table inside because I needed the floor to be able to lay it all out. It was so big. I put each leaf where it belonged, and then laid out the hardware for the table. Each leaf gets 2 hinges. Then the bar and the wedge. I found the easiest way to do this, after doing the first leaf of course, was to actually just put 1 screw in the back of the hinge and 1 screw in the front of the hinge. I tried to do my best to line the center of the hinge with where the leaf and table met. The first time I did this, the leaf, as you can see, was sticking too far out. So I undid the screws and then just put the hinge back a little bit more. That's why going forward with this, I only just did 1 screw in the back and 1 screw in the front of each hinge, and then flipped the leaf back to make sure that it was perfectly level and flat with the table. I then used some wax and of course pre-drilled every screw hole. And then for the bar, I put 2 screws in there, put the bar all the way out to see where it would go, and then I put the wedge where the bar ended, so that the wedge was under the bar. In the description on the website, in the picture on the website, they have the bar actually going over a screw. I found I didn't need that with just the bar and the wedge. It was perfectly flat with the top. If you need to, you could put the wedge further under the bar and it'll actually push more up against the leaf. This is the base that the client gave me, and I had to level the top because when she gave it to me it wasn't level at all. I then pre-drilled for the bolts that I would use to mount the base to the tabletop, making sure to use a bit that was thicker than the actual bolts. As you can see here, it's a very loose hole, and the bolts will not go through the top. I then put the base in the center of the table, pre-drilled for the bolts, used a little bit of wax with each bolt, and then drove the bolts into the tabletop. And then here are some pictures of the final table. I hope you enjoy the video. If you like it, please subscribe for more.